I haven't seen my friend in a year. Her blog just updated. Here's what it says. Wednesday, the 16th of March, 2022. Last night, Robert didn't come back. Jake did, but he hasn't said a word. After questioning and begging him to tell us where Robert was, Janine started screaming. She turned hysterical. I intervened when she grabbed his collar and started shaking him. I told her that maybe he needed some time. She stormed back to her room and sobbed there for maybe an hour. I left Jake alone, hoping he would gather himself and come around. Before he could, Janine came back screaming at him once again. Still no response. All he'd been doing was sitting at the dining table, staring at the wall. Sometimes he would sob and sniffle. Janine's renewed fury didn't seem to change that at all. That's when Janine grabbed a knife. She threatened him in a cold and strangled voice. He just stared ahead. She started shrieking and slamming the knife into the table, close to his hand. When I saw her raise the knife again, I turned in to grab her around the wrist, but she knocked me to the floor. When I got up, she was standing there, panting. The knife was lodged 3 inches deep into Jake's shoulder. He hadn't made a sound, hadn't moved an inch in his seat. He just turned and stared at her with a distant gaze in his tear-stained face. She stopped then, her face scrunched up as she cried once more, then fled back to her room, leaving the knife in his shoulder. I'm not entirely sure why I'm writing this. There's been no internet connection here. Maybe it's just to manage the fear before we set out, make some sense of what's happening. Maybe it's so I have some notes to refer to when we reach the police. Maybe it's to leave something behind if we don't make it. I'm finding it hard to believe I just wrote that sentence. I hope I'll read this entry again someday and laugh at it. We arrived here, Marina Lodge in East Giplin's, Victoria, on Saturday evening. We've been here for 3 full days. Today is the 4th morning. Janine's been my best friend since high school. Robert was her latest boyfriend she'd made at college. They wanted to come out here for a bit to get some nature, a little bit of a break from society, and invited me along. Jake was Robert's friend. Maybe they thought Robert and I would make a cute pair. I'm not sure. He's alright. Was alright. The drive up here from Melbourne was fine. We conversed about everything. Hobbies, movies, politics. Nothing dramatic. I usually sleep on these long drives, but Robert was good at keeping up a conversation, and he was pretty funny. I could see why Janine liked him. We turned off the highway through a small town. I think it was Derby. We didn't stop there. We just drove through and, shortly after, turned off onto a dirt road into the forest. There had been a small sign with Marina Lodge on it, indicating the turnoff. We couldn't have driven for 10 minutes on that road before we reached the lodge. No one greeted us. An envelope was laying on the front doormat with keys and a welcome letter. The letter had a standard list of rules to follow and a number to contact management if we needed them. Fire restrictions and warnings were all low. It had been a wet autumn the week before we arrived. We unpacked the car. There were 6 bedrooms to choose from. Janine and Robert took the one closest to the bathroom. I picked the one closest to the stairs on the opposite end, and Jake took the room 2 doors down from me. Janine and Robert made dinner. We'd come to stay for a week, but we didn't bring a lot of food. Figured we'd just do some grocery shopping at Derby when we needed. Probably find a local pub to dine at a couple of nights. After dinner, we played one of those spill your secrets or drink games. I don't remember anything all that embarrassing or revealing from the game. None of us got drunk. Then we went to bed. I even remember feeling a little bored. First thing we noticed in the morning was the car was missing. Stolen, we thought, but none of us had heard anything during the night, and our bedrooms overlooked where we'd parked. Then we noticed we had no reception. Well, I had noticed that the previous evening before we went to bed, but it truly became significant when we wanted to call the police or the lodge's management. There was also no phone in the lodge. There was just a socket for where it would have been. None of us had noticed the lack of phone the evening before. Despite the car having gone missing, Jake stayed positive. Look at the whole thing as an adventure. We all took point from him and tried our best to look forward. The boys decided they would walk over to Darby to call for help. They didn't take much with them, some bottles of water, and they headed off, and as they rounded the corner of the dirt road, I could hear Jake and Robert talking jovially. They didn't come back for hours. I'm not sure exactly how long. Not long after Jake and Robert had left, Janine and I realized both of our phones had the times frozen at 2:57 a.m. The microwave time was stuck at 2:53 a.m. It was unsettling, but we didn't make a big deal of fuss about it. I thought phones were synchronized to satellite time or something. The boys must have left around 8. The sun had just dipped below the trees when they came back. Janine rushed up to hug Robert. He hugged her back, but he wasn't smiling or laughing anymore. Jake kept looking back at the road. The road doesn't end, the boys tell us. We asked them what they meant. They repeated themselves. We asked if it was possible they missed a turn somewhere. They said they walked for hours. They weren't sure how long their phone clocks had been stuck at 2:57 a.m., though. But they judged from the shadows of the trees that it was around midday when they started to think the road had been going for too long. They turned around and looked for the turnoff they had missed. Eventually, they found themselves back at the lodge. It was a sullen night. I heard Janine and Robert arguing a little at some point. I stayed in my room. I don't know what Jake was doing. The next morning, Jake and Robert got ready to do it again. What else could they do? They figured they simply must have missed a turnoff, or perhaps were disoriented by their inability to tell time. They had maybe given up too soon. Janine and I wondered whether we should follow them, but Jake asked us to stay. He made some weak excuses. I can't even remember what they were. Now when I think about it, I think none of us really wanted to believe what had happened the day before. It must have been just an unlucky chance. Robert assured us that they would find the main road and everything would be fine by evening. But it wasn't. They came back just before nightfall. They looked really confused, really scared. Janine looked like she was about to burst into tears as Robert shook his head, his face pale. We barely said a word to each other that evening. There wasn't much food remaining for dinner. Even though I had no appetite, that was a little alarming. I wanted to ask questions, but the boys looked so despondent that I couldn't bring myself to. I'm not sure if Janine spoke to Robert about what had happened that day. I had such a knot in my stomach that I stayed in one of the toilets the whole evening. It was then that I noticed the silence. There was no wind, no animals, not even insect noises. Just the hum of the electric lights. I didn't sleep well that night. The next day, the boys did not seem prepared to go out at all. Jake was sitting on the stairs outside, just staring at the dirt road again. Robert looked like he was nursing a headache at the dining room table. I had been trying to find a signal all around the lodge, but there was none. As I walked past Robert at some point, he told me, "There isn't any." I stopped and asked him to clarify. There wasn't any signal the whole length of the road they had walked. They had even climbed a tree to spy the surroundings. Nothing. No radio towers, no water towers, no power lines, not even a plume of smoke. Just endless dirt path, slowly winding its way through the trees. Janine appeared then. She looked ready to go. So was I, but for some reason, the boys were able to stop us once more. Third time's the charm, and just give us a chance to redeem ourselves, they said. Robert even managed to smile. Off they went then, backpacks on like they were going on a relaxing hike. We should have gone with them. How stupid were we? It must have been almost noon when they left. As we waited, I noticed the microwave clock was no longer showing. The power had cut out. Janine and I wandered around the lodge trying to understand why, and discovered the lodge ran on a generator round the back. It had run out of fuel. Evening crawled close. It was only then we decided we'd had enough. Janine and I decided that we would go after them. We'd just stepped out onto the dirt path when we saw him coming back. Jake, all by himself. We ran up to him, calling out. There was clearly something wrong. He was pale and breathing heavy. His lips were dry and splitting. His clothes were dusty and mud-spattered. He wouldn't look at us. We asked repeatedly about Robert, but he wouldn't answer. He just kept stumbling resolutely to the lodge. He got himself a glass of water, gulped it down, and collapsed in a dining room chair. Then he just stared at the wall as long shadows crept across it. Janine was beside herself. I don't blame her. I was frustrated too. He wouldn't answer us. He just stared straight ahead. The incident with the knife happened in the last moments of twilight. I gently pulled the knife out of Jake's shoulder. I remembered from first aid training that you weren't supposed to pull the knife out until you were in a place where the bleeding could be controlled. But I didn't think any ambulance was coming. I found a tea towel and placed it on his shoulder, then took his hand and pressed it against it. He didn't resist me. He just stared at me blankly. I let him be and went to my room. Night fell, and I've never felt so suffocated by darkness and silence. I must have fallen asleep just a little at some point. It was hard to tell whether my eyes were open or not, but I could hear Janine sobbing. Slow, agonizingly slow. I felt my way out of my room. I followed the wall to Janine's room, guided by her crying. I knocked gently and whispered to announce my presence. We found each other and held each other tightly. She cried properly on me then. I think I was doing the same. That helped us find some resilience. We used our phone lights, whose battery had become very precious, to make our way down to the kitchen. Jake wasn't sitting there any longer. We didn't say anything about it to each other. We tried on the stove, and to our relief, there was still gas, so it lit up. The blue flame didn't light much, but it was better than the void. There was a fire pit outside. Opening the front door gave me a moment of vertigo. The vastness of the night made me imagine for a moment that we stood at the edge of a precipice over an endless chasm. In the stale, cold air, the abyss felt never-ending. We decided to once more use our phones to navigate. We found a stick in the pit, lit up the stove, and then went back to the fire pit. I was very grateful for Janine's campfire skills, as she soon had a decent fire going. We shared a blanket, sitting along a log near the fire. I was about to drift back to sleep when Janine mumbled something. "What is it?" "Stars. There's no stars," she said. I looked up. Just an ocean of endless black. "A cloud cover," I said aloud. She nodded. I think she was trying to believe me. I think I was trying to believe myself. I woke up this morning at the crack of dawn, the faintest gray in the east. My body was tired, but a surge of adrenaline took me. Janine was still asleep. I went in and found Jake in his room, curled up on a bed. I packed everything I think we'd need in a couple of backpacks we brought. It wasn't much. I ruefully remembered there had been a torch in Robert's car, but there's not much point in that thought now. I'm writing this just waiting for the others to get up. We're getting out of here, all three of us. I hope my next update will be written somewhere far, far from here. You're still here. I thought you might be. Thanks for joining me for tonight's story. If your insatiable appetite for horror knows no bounds, might I suggest one of our playlists, or one of our previous stories in the archive? There should be one appearing at the end of the story any minute now. And of course, if you're not subscribed, why not go ahead and hit that subscribe button? Maybe hit that notification bell so you don't miss any of the spooky things that we do here. If you prefer your horror a little more analog, you can always pick up one of my books. There's a link below to my latest, and it'll take you to all the great things that I've posted on Amazon. For my book lovers in the audience, I always suggest coming on down to Patreon so you can become part of my ghostly reader tier and get a book anytime I write one, which is usually about twice a year. Speaking of my patrons, let's go ahead and thank them, shall we? Thanks to Unicorn Hollow for being our spooky ghost contributor. Thanks to Janet and Lady Vengeance for being our spooky skeleton tier contributors. Thanks to Hi Stacy, Winter, Xaronan, Emily Coltsfoot, Stephanie Carrington, Marianne Schuler, Tyler Parker, and Jennifer Damron for being our ghostly reader tier contributors. Thanks, everyone. We just couldn't do the show without you. If you think you might like to support the show in a more monetary fashion, come on down to Patreon. I have many tiers. I'm sure you'll find one that suits you best. I always recommend the ghostly reader tier since you get a signed book anytime I write one on your doorstep. But I have many tiers, and again, I'm sure you'll find one to suit you. And as always, thanks for stopping by. Dr. Plague, signing off. Have a wonderful evening.